January 26, 1945. Holtzwihr, France. The Alsatian plain lies locked in winter. Snow crusts the fields. Ice hardens the ground until every footstep sounds louder than it should. Smoke drifts low, clinging to the earth as if it has nowhere else to go. At the edge of the village, a German aid station flickers with lamplight. Medics work in silence, hands dark with blood, breath visible in the cold air. Wounded men are carried in one by one, then two at a time, then faster than the stretchers can be cleared. An hour earlier, a reinforced German force had moved forward with confidence. 250 infantrymen, 6 armored vehicles, a coordinated attack against what appeared to be a collapsing American position. Now, fewer than 70 effective soldiers remain. Outside, in the frozen field, a tank destroyer still burns. Its metal frame glows dull orange beneath the smoke. Perched on its exposed hull, a single American officer had stood, wounded, isolated, refusing evacuation. Below him, a machine gun had spoken in long, relentless bursts. The Germans do not speak of the man. They speak of a sound, a deep, rhythmic thunder, slow enough to count, heavy enough to feel through the chest. It was not a secret weapon, not a technological marvel. It was an American machine gun, first designed more than a decade before the war began. Yet in that frozen hour at Holtzwihr, it stopped an entire attack cold. And what the survivors witnessed that day was not an exception, but a pattern that had already spread across Europe. A pattern that began long before this field ever froze. Before the fear took shape. When war returned to Europe in September 1939, Germany entered the conflict with confidence born of preparation. 6 years of rearmament had transformed the Reichswehr into a modern, mechanized force. Its doctrine emphasized speed, coordination, and decisive shock. Wars would be won quickly, before industry, manpower, and resources could be exhausted. The early campaigns appeared to confirm this belief. Poland collapsed in weeks. France fell in 44 days. Across Europe, German officers concluded that superior training, tight discipline, and well-designed weapons could overcome numerical inferiority. The United States watched these events from across the Atlantic. In 1939, its army ranked 17th in the world, smaller than Portugal's. American doctrine was unfashionable, even derided. It did not seek tactical elegance. It sought endurance. American planners assumed that any future war would be long, global, and industrial. Victory would not come from perfect maneuvers, but from sustaining pressure long after others had reached exhaustion. This belief shaped every decision, especially in weapons development. The Browning .50 caliber machine gun was not designed for World War II. Its origins lay in the final months of the First World War. In 1917, the U.S. Army confronted a new problem. Enemy aircraft and armored vehicles were becoming too robust for rifle-caliber fire. John Moses Browning was tasked with creating a heavier weapon capable of defeating both. The result was a half-inch projectile, massive by machine gun standards. It struck with brute force rather than finesse. Early versions were heavy, water-cooled, and awkward, but they worked. Throughout the 1920s, as Europe experimented with specialization, light machine guns for infantry, cannons for aircraft, anti-tank rifles for armor, the Americans refined a single weapon. They simplified it. They strengthened it. They made it reliable above all else. In 1933, the air-cooled Browning M2 entered service. It was not revolutionary. It did not fire faster than German weapons. It was not lighter. It was not more precise. It was simply durable. At the same time, Germany pursued a different path. The MG-34 and later the MG-42 were masterpieces of engineering. High rates of fire, quick change barrels, tactically flexible, but they demanded trained crews, careful maintenance, and constant logistical attention. German doctrine treated the machine gun as the centerpiece of the infantry squad. American doctrine treated the machine gun as one tool among many. This difference mattered. As war expanded in 1940 and 1941, Germany assumed the United States would be slow to adapt. Its industrial base appeared civilian, scattered, inefficient. American weapons were mocked as crude and overbuilt. The Browning .50 caliber seemed to confirm this prejudice. Too heavy for infantry maneuver. Too slow-firing to compete with the MG-42. Excessive for most battlefield targets. German officers studying pre-war intelligence reports dismissed it as a niche weapon. An anti-aircraft gun. A vehicle-mounted curiosity. What they failed to understand was that the Americans were not designing a weapon for elegance or specialization. They were designing a weapon for repetition. For production lines. For untrained replacements. For mud, cold, heat, and neglect. For a war measured not in battles, but in months and years. By the time the United States entered the war in December 1941, the foundation had already been laid. Factories were tooled. Training manuals were written. Logistics systems were planned around abundance rather than scarcity. The Browning M2 was ready, not as a masterpiece, but as a constant. And soon, German soldiers would encounter it not once, but everywhere. From the ground, from the air, from vehicles that never seemed to stop moving. The fear had not yet taken shape, but the conditions that would create it were already locked into place. When industry entered the battlefield, the entry of the United States into the war did not immediately change the battlefield. In early 1942, American units were inexperienced, unevenly led, and still learning how to fight a modern war. German veterans in North Africa and the Mediterranean initially dismissed them as poorly trained and overly cautious. But beneath those early impressions, something different was building. American war planning did not begin at the front line. It began in factories, rail yards, and ports. The United States did not seek parity with German production. It sought saturation. By mid-1942, American industry was producing weapons on a scale that had no historical precedent. Aircraft, vehicles, artillery pieces, and ammunition flowed in quantities that reshaped how war could be fought. The Browning M2 became a beneficiary of this transformation. Production of the .50 caliber machine gun expanded rapidly. Multiple manufacturers were assigned contracts. Interchangeable parts were standardized to a degree that simplified maintenance in the field. A broken gun was replaced, not repaired. A worn barrel was swapped out in minutes. Just as important was ammunition. The .50 caliber cartridge required brass, powder, steel, and precise machining. The Americans invested in all of it. By 1943, billions of rounds were being produced annually. This abundance shaped doctrine. American units were not trained to conserve ammunition. They were trained to dominate space. Suppress first. Advance second. Everywhere American forces went, the Browning followed. Bombers carried it as their primary defense. Fighters carried it as their main armament. Half-tracks mounted it. Trucks mounted it. Tanks carried it not as an afterthought, but as a standard fixture. This was not accidental. American planners believed that a weapon effective in many roles was more valuable than a perfect weapon for a single task. The M2 could engage aircraft, infantry, vehicles, and fortifications. It could fire from tripods, vehicle mounts, turrets, and aircraft wings. German doctrine had no equivalent concept. Weapons were optimized for roles, not universality. When a system failed or ammunition ran short, there was no substitute. The first major signs of this imbalance appeared in the air. By 1943, American bomber formations penetrated deep into German airspace in daylight. Each B-17 carried 13.50 caliber machine guns. Formations were arranged so that every approach vector was covered by overlapping fire. German pilots attacking these formations encountered something unfamiliar. Not precision, volume. The Browning did not rely on explosive rounds. Its bullets tore through aluminum, control cables, fuel lines, and pilots with kinetic force alone. Fighters that survived attack runs returned riddled with holes. Airframes structurally compromised even when engines still ran. Losses mounted. On the ground, the pattern repeated. In North Africa, American armored units began mounting .50 calibers on every vehicle capable of carrying one. Convoys bristled with heavy machine guns. German ambush tactics that had worked against British columns failed when American vehicles returned fire instantly in an overwhelming volume. The lesson was learned quickly and applied everywhere. By the time American forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, the Browning M2 was no longer a supporting weapon. It was part of the environment. Hedgerows were swept with sustained fire before infantry moved. Roads were interdicted by vehicle-mounted guns firing on suspicion alone. Urban streets were raked from upper stories to rooftops before armor advanced. German units discovered that concealment no longer meant safety. Stone walls cracked. Trees shattered. Light vehicles burned where they stood. What unsettled German commanders most was not the damage. It was the predictability. Where Americans went, the guns followed. Where resistance appeared, the fire came immediately. The Browning M2 did not win battles by itself, but it made movement dangerous, delay costly, and defense temporary. By late 1944, German intelligence reports increasingly mentioned a recurring problem. American forces seemed able to apply overwhelming firepower at any point, at any time, regardless of weather or terrain. The weapon that made this possible was never rare. It was never held back. It was always there. And German soldiers were beginning to understand that they were not facing isolated machines, but a system built to grind resistance down until nothing remained. That realization would soon be felt not in planning rooms, but in frozen fields, shattered towns, and burning vehicles, where fear took on a very specific sound. The human weight of the .50 caliber. For the German infantrymen, fear did not arrive suddenly. It accumulated. At first, the Browning M2 was just another sound on the battlefield, deeper than rifle fire, slower than the MG-42, easy to identify, but unlike other weapons, it did not stop. German soldiers learned this in Normandy's bocage. Hedgerows offered concealment, but not protection. When American units advanced, they did not probe cautiously. They fired first. Tree lines were swept in long bursts. Stone walls chipped and collapsed. Farm buildings were riddled until windows, doors, and upper floors disintegrated. The German instinct to wait, to conserve ammunition, to strike decisively, became a liability. Every pause allowed American gunners to blanket suspected positions with fire. Those under it described the same sensation. The rounds did not crack like rifle bullets. They struck with weight. Earth jumped. Wood exploded outward. Metal screamed. Medical officers soon recognized the difference in casualties. Rifle wounds might be survivable. Machine gun wounds sometimes were. But a .50 caliber hit carried a different outcome. The projectile's mass transferred enormous energy. Limbs shattered. Bones fragmented. Torso wounds were catastrophic. Field surgeons near the front learned to identify .50 caliber casualties immediately. There was little to be done beyond stabilizing shock and easing pain. Many wounded never reached evacuation points. But physical injury was only part of the cost. Units subjected to sustained .50 caliber fire showed higher rates of psychological collapse. Men who had survived artillery bombardments froze under heavy machine gun fire that seemed to ignore cover entirely. Tracers intensified the effect. American ammunition belts typically mixed one tracer for every 4 ball rounds. At night, this created streams of visible fire. German soldiers watched glowing arcs converge on their positions. They could see death approaching. They also understood the mathematics. For every tracer visible, for unseen rounds followed the same path. Veterans learned not to look. Replacements often could not look away. The sound reinforced the helplessness. The Browning's steady cadence lacked the frantic buzz of the MG-42. It felt deliberate, unhurried, relentless. German squad leaders reported that once .50 caliber fire began, control disintegrated quickly. Orders were lost beneath noise. Movement stopped. Men pressed into the ground and waited for it to end. Often it did not. The psychological impact extended beyond direct contact. Units that had experienced sustained .50 caliber fire became hesitant even when it was absent. They avoided daylight movement. They delayed attacks. They clung to cover longer than doctrine allowed. American forces exploited this instinctively. Reconnaissance by fire became standard practice. Suspicious terrain was swept without confirmation. The goal was not accuracy, it was denial. Deny movement. Deny initiative. Deny confidence. 4 German soldiers trained to believe that skill and discipline could overcome material disadvantages. This was deeply unsettling. They were not being outmaneuvered. They were being erased from the battlefield's surface until resistance collapsed. And as this realization spread, the fear ceased to be personal. It became institutional. German units began reporting not specific enemy formations, but the presence of American heavy machine guns as a tactical condition in itself. The Browning M2 was no longer a weapon they encountered. It was an environment they endured. And that environment would soon expand beyond the ground, into the sky above them. Steel from above, silence below. 4 German airmen, the Browning .50 caliber revealed its true nature not in isolation, but in numbers. September 6, 1943. The skies over Stuttgart. American B-17 formations pushed toward the city in daylight, engines droning in tight combat boxes. To German fighter pilots, the bombers appeared slow, vulnerable, almost clumsy. Doctrine demanded aggressive interception. Close in. Fire cannons. Break the formation. At long range, the attack began normally. 20mm shells streaked toward the lead bombers. Then the formations answered, not with explosions, but with fire. Muzzle flashes erupted across the bomber stream. Nose turrets, ball turrets, waist guns, tail guns. Every approach vector lit up at once. Each aircraft carried 13 Browning M2 machine guns. A single combat box put hundreds into the air simultaneously. The volume was unprecedented. German pilots felt aircraft shudder as rounds punched through wings, control surfaces, engines, and cockpits. It did not need to be precise. The mass of fire ensured damage through probability alone. Fighter units adapted quickly. Head-on attacks, high-speed passes, diving approaches. None provided consistent safety. The American formation was designed for overlap. Approach from one angle and multiple guns engaged. Close the distance and the density of fire increased. More alarming than the casualties was the reliability. German cannons jammed in cold air. Ammunition feeds froze. Weapons failed at critical moments. The Brownings did not. They fired in extreme cold. They fired after absorbing damage. They fired until barrels glowed. Pilots began reporting that American bombers were not defended by armor, but by endurance. By late 1943, Luftwaffe losses became unsustainable. Experienced pilots were lost faster than they could be replaced. German training pipelines collapsed under attrition. What German airmen faced was not a superior aircraft. It was a system that allowed bombers to protect themselves through saturation fire. On the ground, German commanders reached similar conclusions. In Normandy, Panzer divisions encountered American columns bristling with .50 caliber guns. Every jeep, every half-track, every tank. Movement in daylight became dangerous. Any attempt to reposition drew immediate fire. General officers later wrote that American forces seemed to create firepower out of empty space. They did not wait to identify threats. They fired to prevent them from forming. Leadership struggled to adapt. German doctrine prized fire discipline and maneuver. American doctrine assumed ammunition abundance and constant pressure. The difference widened in urban combat. Stone buildings offer concealment but not safety. .50 caliber rounds penetrated multiple walls, ceilings, and floors. Defenders were forced out before infantry even advanced. Technology alone did not explain this dominance. The M2 was not sophisticated. It was not elegant. It was reliable, produced by the hundreds of thousands, supplied by billions of rounds, operated by crews trained to fire without hesitation. German officers increasingly described the weapon not as a machine, but as a condition of fighting Americans at all. And as 1944 turned into 1945, this condition would reach its breaking point, when German forces attempted one final gamble in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. There, the steady thunder they feared would decide more than tactics. It would decide the war's final direction, when volume became decisive. By mid-1944, the Western Front no longer revolved around maneuver. It revolved around endurance. After the Normandy landings, German forces attempted to contain the Allied bridgehead through localized counterattacks and elastic defense. What they encountered instead was a grinding expansion of firepower, deliberate, methodical, and relentless. In the bocage south of St. Lo, visibility was measured in meters. The terrain favored defenders. German infantry and panzer teams were positioned to ambush advancing armor at close range. American doctrine answered not with caution, but with suppression. Before infantry moved, .50 caliber machine guns swept the hedgerows. Not short bursts, sustained fire. Leaves shredded. Branches snapped. Earth leapt into the air. The intent was not to kill every defender. It was to deny movement entirely. German units discovered that even if they survived the initial fire, their ability to respond collapsed. Panzerfaust teams could not expose themselves long enough to aim. Machine gun crews lost line of sight under the violence of incoming fire. When Operation Cobra began on July 25, 1944, the imbalance became undeniable. American bombers flattened German defensive belts west of St. Lo. But it was the follow-on assault that proved decisive. As armored columns surged forward, every vehicle fired. Tanks, half-tracks, recon vehicles. The .50 caliber was everywhere. German formations attempting to regroup found themselves engaged immediately. Columns were broken apart before cohesion could form. Withdrawal routes were swept by continuous fire. General Fritz Bayerlein, commanding Panzer Division, later wrote that his units ceased to function as a coherent force not because of a single blow, but because constant fire prevented effective command and movement. In the air, the pattern continued. Republic P-47 Thunderbolts dominated the battlefield. Each carried 8 Browning .50 caliber machine guns, more than some entire ground units possessed. During strafing runs, pilots walked fire across roads, fields, and villages. Vehicles ignited. Columns scattered. Men abandoned equipment instinctively. German ground troops learned to recognize the aircraft by sound alone. By the time they looked up, the guns were already firing. Air superiority multiplied the effect of ground-mounted weapons. Units could not move by day. They could not concentrate by night. Every attempt to restore initiative failed under volume. By autumn 1944, German forces in France were retreating toward the Reich. The retreat was not orderly. It was harried. American convoy doctrine ensured that even logistics units were heavily armed. Ambushes collapsed under immediate return fire. Interdiction attempts became suicidal. This had strategic consequences. German planning relied on disrupting Allied supply lines. That disruption never materialized. Fuel, ammunition, and replacements flowed forward uninterrupted. The Browning M2 became the connective tissue of American operations. It linked infantry, armor, air power, and logistics into a single, reinforcing system. German intelligence assessments began using new language. They no longer spoke of American tactics or formations alone. They spoke of an inability to operate under constant heavy machine gun fire. Still, German leadership believed one opportunity remained. A surprise offensive. Bad weather. Restricted air power. In December 1944, they committed everything they had left to one final gamble. Into forests where snow muted sound and visibility shrank to nothing. The Ardennes. There, American firepower would be tested under the worst possible conditions. And there it would not fail. The Ardennes, fire that would not freeze. December 1944. The Ardennes forest. Snow-buried roads. Fog-grounded aircraft. Temperatures dropped low enough to freeze lubricants and shatter morale. German planners believed these conditions would neutralize Allied advantages. No air power, limited visibility, restricted movement. What they underestimated was the endurance of American systems and the role of the Browning .50 caliber within them. When German armored spearheads broke through thin American lines, chaos followed. Supply dumps were overrun. Units were isolated. Roads clogged with retreating columns and refugees. But even in withdrawal, American vehicles fought. Convoys were not unarmed targets. Every truck carried a .50 caliber mount. Every roadblock became a strong point. German infantry advancing through forest trails encountered sudden, overwhelming fire for vehicles they had assumed were non-combatant. Ambushes failed instantly. At Bastogne, the pattern intensified. Surrounded and cut off, American paratroopers and armor crews turned defensive positions into overlapping kill zones. The frozen ground prevented deep entrenchment. Instead, firepower compensated. Heavy machine guns dominated approaches. Snowbanks offered no protection. Tree trunks splintered under repeated impacts. German assaults stalled before reaching effective range. The weather tested everything. Weapons seized. Hands froze to metal. The M2 continued to fire. Designed decades earlier, the Browning tolerated cold that crippled more complex systems. Crews learned to keep actions dry, to cycle bolts by hand, to warm feed trays with gloved hands. The guns stayed in action. As skies cleared after Christmas, air power returned. But the ground fight had already been decided. German units were exhausted. Losses were irreplaceable. Fuel was gone. When American counterattacks began, they advanced behind walls of fire. Every ridgeline was swept. Every suspected position suppressed before movement. The offensive collapsed, not in a dramatic breakthrough, but in attrition. German soldiers who survived later described the same sensation they had felt in Normandy and France. The inability to move without being detected, engaged, and pinned by heavy machine gun fire. The Ardennes had proven what earlier battles suggested. American dominance did not depend on perfect conditions. It depended on systems that functioned when conditions were worst. By January 1945, the German army in the West had lost its last operational reserve. What remained was defensive delay. The Browning M2 had outlasted weather, terrain, and enemy adaptation. It had become not merely a weapon, but a constant, one that shaped how the enemy fought, moved, and ultimately collapsed. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the frozen forests of Belgium, its presence was felt long before it was seen. And when the war ended, it did not disappear. It remained in service. It remains in service still. A century-old design that learned, early on, a brutal lesson. If a weapon fires when others fail, it decides battles long before strategy can. The weapon that refused to leave the battlefield. When the guns finally fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the Browning M2 did not join the long list of weapons rendered obsolete by peace. It remained. Across shattered cities and occupied territory, American units still mounted .50 caliber machine guns on vehicles, rooftops, and checkpoints. Not for combat, but for assurance. German civilians noticed it immediately. The silhouette, the thick barrel, the ammunition belts heavier than anything they had seen. It was a reminder of how the war had been fought and why it had ended as it did. In official after-action reports, American commanders rarely singled out the M2 as revolutionary. It was not treated as a miracle weapon. Instead, it appeared repeatedly in logistical summaries and reliability assessments. It worked. It was always there. It required little explanation. This understated presence was precisely its strength. Unlike tanks or aircraft, the Browning did not symbolize technological leaps. It symbolized consistency. In the years that followed, armies around the world attempted to replace it. New heavy machine guns promised lighter weight, higher rates of fire, or improved ergonomics. Few succeeded. The M2 continued into Korea, where it dominated ridgelines and supply routes. In Vietnam, It defended firebases and river patrol craft. In the deserts of the Middle East, it mounted on vehicles once again, facing a new generation of enemies. What began as a World War I design had outlived every conflict that followed. The reason was not nostalgia. It was doctrine. World War II had proven that battles were not always decided by precision alone. They were decided by the ability to sustain pressure under any condition for as long as necessary. The Browning M2 embodied that principle. German veterans, interviewed decades later, rarely spoke of the weapon with anger. They spoke of it with resignation. It had not outsmarted them. It had not surprised them. It had simply been there everywhere, every time they tried to move. Historians now recognize the .50 caliber not as a tactical curiosity, but as an operational force multiplier. It bridged infantry, armor, air power, and logistics into a single ecosystem of fire. Few weapons achieve that status. Even fewer retain it for a century. The legacy of the Browning M2 is not measured in kill counts or battles won. It is measured in how it reshaped enemy behavior. It denied initiative. It denied movement. It denied confidence. In war, those denials are often more decisive than destruction itself. When future generations study why American forces advanced when others stalled, why supply lines held, why units endured, why momentum never truly broke, they will find the answer not only in strategy rooms or factories, but behind a steel receiver stamped with a simple designation. M2, not a relic of the past, but a lesson written in steel, fire, and time.